Well, welcome, folks. It's getting closer to Christmas. You know, demographics mean something, you know. That means how many people are around. Well, it turns out the United States is losing people for the first time in decades, centuries, actually. And the state that's losing it fastest is New York. And then the fastest growing state is Utah, of all places. And the trend is toward the South and the West. And as a result, there's going to be redistricting, more congressmen for various states. Rhode Island will wind up with one congressman. New York will lose congressman. California, Texas will gain congressman. So that's interesting what's happening. But something else. Did you ever used to watch basketball? I used to think the Chicago Bulls with Michael Jordan were the most fabulous basketball team. I loved watching them. And Jordan had a head fake, and he would fake and move to the basket and score. Well, the president is using a head fake. And what he's doing, he's been driven into the corner with all this business about him, Mueller and investigations and all this, and Flynn and so forth. And so he pulls a head fake. He says, I'm commander-in-chief, and I'm going to pull out of Syria. And everybody says, ah, and they start focusing on Syria. They take their eyes off something else. It's a head fake, and he's a master of it. But the surprise came when he says, I'm pulling everything out of Syria, and it's a crucial time when Russia and Iran are getting stronger and seeking more influence in the region.
Well, the president said that the United States has defeated ISIS, which was his goal, and that it's time for the 2,000 U.S. troops to come home. As CBN's Jenna Browder reports from Washington, many hope the decision can be changed.
GOP leaders were caught off guard when President Trump announced the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria. And now some of his closest allies are pushing back.
If this decision is a withdrawal of all of our forces in Syria, now we're dramatically less safe. This is an Obama-like move.
Colossal, in my mind, mistake, a grave error. ISIS is not defeated.
Senators Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio say they were blindsided by the news, especially in light of recent statements made by administration officials that the mission is not complete.
If we've learned one thing over the years, enduring defeat of a group like this means you can't just defeat their physical space and then leave. You have to make sure the internal security forces are in place to ensure that those security gains are enduring.
But the president says it's time.
And we have won against ISIS, and now it's time for our troops to come back home.
CBN News senior international correspondent Gary Lane.
The president believes that ISIS is defeated, at least the caliphate. There's no capital in Raqqa, Syria anymore. They don't hold massive amounts of territory there, maybe just a small area in the eastern part of Syria near the Iraqi border. So he feels they have been defeated, but they really haven't been defeated as far as numbers. There's still 20 to 30,000 fighters inside Syria.
Not everyone disagrees with the president. Senator Rand Paul applauded the announcement.
We've been at war for too long. I commend the president for his decision.
Others compare the move to former President Obama's decision to prematurely pull out of Iraq, which led to the rise of ISIS. It could also weaken U.S. influence in the region. Andrew Gable with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies tells CBN News pulling out will weaken the United States' leverage in dealing with Syria, Turkey, Russia, and Iran, leaving a vacuum waiting to be filled.
And then you're looking at a situation in which Iran functionally controls territory from the west border of Afghanistan all the way to the Mediterranean Sea.
The pullout will also hurt U.S. allies like the Kurds and Democratic Syrian forces who fought alongside our troops against ISIS. President Trump spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Turkish President Erdogan before making the announcement. Wednesday, the administration announced a $3.5 million arms sale to Turkey. The administration hopes to have troops home by mid-January. In Washington, Jenna Browder, CBN News.
Thanks, Jenna. Believe me, folks, it's a head fake. He's wanted, you know, they wouldn't give him the border wall. Now, the next thing that I think the president ought to do is to have buses all set up at the border when all those illegals come in, and he ought to put them on buses, give them nice rations and plenty of water, and ship them to Nancy Pelosi's district in California and let them all out. That's what he ought to do. That would be
He's thinking her house.
Huh? Well, they could visit her house. She's out dancing. She's having a party to celebrate the victory. Okay. Well, let those people show up in her district And just, if the president can do that, he can do a head fake with Syria. He can do the same thing. Just have buses, give plenty of combat rations, plenty of water, look after them, take them on board the bus, say, we're going to take you to a nice place in San Francisco. This is the home of a nice lady named Mrs. Pelosi. And you're going to be her guest, and we're going to let all of you out at her doorstep. And it would be wonderful. And then they'll begin to understand what that border security is all about. But it's a head fake, folks. The president's a master at it, and he's just pulled one. So what are we talking about today? Are we talking about the wall? Are we talking about his defeat? Are we talking about Miller? No, we're talking about Syria. He knows what to do. So anyhow, give him a little credit for being smart. Well, in other news, the Fed's decision to raise interest rates shook the Dow and global markets. John Jesper has more.
That's right, Pat. Global markets slumped and the dollar dropped after the Fed's interest rate hike Wednesday. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell announced a quarter-point increase, also adding the Fed will slow the rate of increase in 2019, forecasting only 2 hikes instead of 3. Here at home, the market closed more than 350 points down, its lowest point since September 2017. Well, rising interest rates are making it harder to pay down our national debt. Right now, it's more than a whopping $21 trillion and still climbing. CBN White House correspondent Ben Kennedy went to the Office of Management and Budget to uncover the cause for the spike.
D.C. is in the midst of a bipartisan spending spree, which clearly is not the way to go, since the federal budget deficit is projected to hit $1 trillion this fiscal year. Washington racked up a $350 billion deficit in October and November alone. That's up from $202 billion during the same time last year. Major deficits like that are expected to drive the $21 trillion national debt to $33 trillion within 10 years. When people hear $1 trillion a year on the national debt, should they be worried? Should they be concerned?
Absolutely. It is a major problem.
Russell Vogt is the deputy director at the Office of Management and Budget. He's now taking charge of the agency since OMB Director Mick Mulvaney shifted his focus to his new role as White House Chief of Staff.
We're still in the middle of the transition, but we are going to be running it smoothly and orderly. One of the things that we have prioritized is trying to find ways to reduce spending.
Vogt says one way is to find programs that are no longer used or inefficient. He also calls on Congress to practice restraint on spending.
Russ, what do you say for people calling out for demands for tax increases to kind of offset the debt?
Well, this is where we would have a dispute with them. We don't think that the revenue side is where the problem is. You look at what Americans spend in food, clothing, and shelter, and it amounts to about $4.6 trillion, right? We don't think that, and that's generally what we spend in terms, or what we take in revenue. We don't want to cause them, the American family, the American taxpayer, to have to absorb a greater share of responsibility.
In just the last 2 years, Washington paid out more than $450 billion in interest payments on the national debt. With the Fed raising rates at a quarter point, you can add another $50 billion to those payments each year.
Will this fast increase in the national debt have an impact on the overall economic growth?
Eventually, it certainly will. One of the things that we're very concerned about as we look 10 years, 15 years out into the time frame is the extent to which debt will lead to interest costs that eventually exceed even what we spend in the military on.
Now, federal borrowing continues to rise thanks to Congress voting to suspend the debt ceiling earlier this year. The government won't face any borrowing limit until March of 2019. Ben Kennedy, CBN News, the White House.
Thanks, Ben. Pat, I was reading this morning that the federal debt is on pace to rise at the fastest level of increase since 2012.
It's unbelievable, and it's just roaring out of sight. And folks, they're not concentrating on it. From the president on down, Congress is just paying, they're spending money that doesn't exist, and they're going deeper and deeper in debt. And I say it now, and I say it as often as I possibly can. This is what's going to destroy the governments of the world. There's going to be a massive, massive collapse. And when it comes, it's going to be the most painful thing you could imagine. There's going to be poverty all over the world. There'll be wars. There'll be uprisings. There'll be famine. It'll be absolutely ghastly. And we're looking right now, oh, I've heard 70, 75 trillion, maybe it's a whole lot more than that, but trillions of dollars. And there's no way that anybody's going to pay it off. We can't do it. And as we pointed out in that story, just 0.25%, you add $50 billion to the cost of servicing that enormous debt. Debt is a monstrous thing. It keeps multiplying, and it multiplies, and it grows bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's just like this monstrous wave that is going to come over us. And nobody, and I mean literally nobody, in positions of power seems to be doing anything about it. The Congress, they're going to keep spending money because they go home and they're not going to get reelected on the basis of fiscal restraint. The voters want more goodies. And so people are demanding more of this, more pay for this and the other. You know, there was a Simpson-Bowles commission. Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles, who'd been formerly with North Carolina as a chancellor university, and they came up with a plan that was absolutely brilliant. And it would have solved the problem, would have brought spending under control, brought our debt under control little by little by little. It would have put us on a balanced basis. It was given to Obama, and it was like shoved into the desk drawer and ignored. Well, we're going to pay the cost of all this. But, you know, the biggest thing they've got to take care of is entitlements. And people now, they're getting older and older, and there's more and more money going out with Social Security, less and less earning. It's going to be a terrible crisis. It's hitting Japan. It's hitting other nations. Folks, just listen. It's coming. And you don't have to have an asteroid hit us. You don't have to have some massive tsunami in the ocean. All you've got to do is continue to pile up wasteful debt, and the wasteful debt will become a mountain that will absolutely fall on you and crush you. John.
Pat, staying on the topic of government spending, the Senate passed a bill keeping the government open until February 8th. It funds 9 departments that would have run out of money on midnight Friday. The House is expected to pass the stopgap measure today and send it on to President Trump. The bill does not include the $5 billion Mr. Trump wanted for a border wall. Some supporters say the president should stand his ground. GOP Congressman Mark Meadows, head of the Congressional Freedom Caucus, says they'll back the president if he vetoes the bill. Well, Congress is making a rare show of bipartisanship in the season of hope and goodwill. A sweeping overhaul of the criminal justice system is expected to pass the House today and then head to the president's desk. Capitol Hill correspondent Abigail Robertson explains how this bill will make crucial changes in sentencing and rehabilitation.
Morale is high on Capitol Hill this week after lawmakers reached a historic compromise on criminal justice reform.
This may be my proudest moment in 8 years of the United States Senate.
Even Senate Democrat Dick Durbin, who's pushed this issue for years, and many of his colleagues praised the White House, specifically President Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, for helping to deliver this bipartisan victory.
We worked with him throughout this whole endeavor. The net result of it last night is nothing short of an historic vote that really changes our outlook on our system of justice for the first time in decades.
Democrat Senator Amy Klobuchar also praised members of the weekly bipartisan Senate prayer breakfast.
Some of the people involved in that played some critical roles coming out of that in criminal justice reform, just because I think there's also a religious piece of this where people sit back and they look at the criminal justice system and say to themselves, is this really right? Is this consistent with sort of faith-based look at the world?
Key components in the First Step Act include lowering mandatory minimums, allowing more inmates to serve time under house arrest or halfway homes instead of prison cells, giving judges more discretion for sentencing certain crimes, and outlawing the shackling of pregnant inmates.
To the critics of the bill, you say that somebody under this bill will get out and do something bad. That's probably true. But what I hope you'll realize that most people who get out under this bill a bit early are going to contribute mightily.
Lawmakers hope the bill brings an end to overcrowded prisons and lowers the burden on taxpayers footing the bill for incarcerating inmates. Senator Cory Booker, however, reminds his colleagues this is indeed just the first step, and there's more work to be done on this issue.
There are still lots of injustices that we need to address. This is a first step in a long journey, and the bipartisan commitment, including the White House, who said to me they're committed to continuing the work. Let's celebrate, but the work must continue.
As lawmakers celebrate this bipartisan win, some have expressed it could be a sign of more cooperation to come in 2019. Reporting from Capitol Hill, Abigail Robertson, CBN News.
Thanks, Abigail. Well, two storm systems are set to converge, bringing massive amounts of rain to the East Coast just as millions set out for holiday travel. In the south, heavy rains are drenching New Orleans and West Texas. Meanwhile, the storm that brought high winds to the West Coast and a rare December tornado to Washington state is on the move. Those two storms are on a collision course in the southeast and could cause nightmare travel for nearly 120 million people who are traveling along the East Coast. And Pat, I think you appropriately compared these storm systems to the Grinch yesterday.
Yeah, well, that Grinch is on the way, whatever. We didn't ask him, but he's coming. Yes. But that's, I don't know where all that rain is, but it's just, you know, I was talking to Hugh Ross, and we were talking about the origin of the Earth. And I said, you know, they found water on Mars, and isn't that a big deal or something? He says, you know, the Earth was covered with water, that there's all sorts of water in the universe. I didn't know that. He said, a planet, I thought that we had water on this planet because of some passing meteor or some, you know, well, some astronomical marvel that hit us filled with ice. But he said, no, we had all sorts of water. It was getting rid of the water. But we're going to be trying to get rid of a whole lot of water.
I was just going to say it. Now it's reoccurring.
That's going to be the issue. All right.